Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and be among friends and to share some thoughts about making the world more peaceful. I was inspired in my youth by Albert Camus in his essay on the myth of Sisyphus, which he began by quoting the Greek poet Pindar, who said, "Do not aspire to immortal life, but exhaust the limits of the possible." And George Bernard Shaw famously said, "Some see the world as it is and say, why? I dream dreams that never were and say, why not?" And I set out to exhaust my limits in the pursuit of peace. Why not? Why not peace? Let me start off here with a short quiz. How many of you raised children or grew up with siblings? You ever get into fights and disputes with your siblings or your children? Did your parents give you hand grenades to solve the problem? No? Why not? Because it would be stupid, wouldn't it? And what about neighbors? You ever heard of neighbors getting into disputes with one another? Yeah, it happens all the time. Do they plant landmines to mark the borders to keep hostile neighbors away? Why not? Because it would be stupid. And what about the business world? There we go. Corporations drop bombs on each other and, oops, I'm having trouble getting this to move. There we go. They drop bombs on each other when they get mad at each other. They fire rockets at each other. Why not? Because it would be stupid. So if the use of violence is stupid in our homes and in our neighborhoods and in the business world, why do we consider it to be honorable, noble, and patriotic at the nation-state level? Think about it. Think about it. War is stupid. And I like to take it from somebody who knows something about it. General and President Dwight Eisenhower said, "I hate war, its brutality, its futility, its stupidity." So if war is stupid, why does it persist? And I would say because we simply have not yet developed the alternatives to the use of violence at that level. But the good news is that we are doing it. We call it peace building. For the first time in human history, think about this, for the first time in human history, we are studying peace. We've always studied war to figure out how to win the next one. We are now studying war to figure out how to prevent the next one. That never happened before in human history. It's happening now. When I went to school 50 years ago, if I wanted to study peace, I couldn't do it because there were no programs anywhere in the world where you could study peace, conflict resolution. Didn't exist. Now there are over 200 certified graduate programs in studying peace and conflict resolution. That's pretty amazing. And we built the institutions that can make it happen. We've got books. Again, if I went on Amazon 50 years ago, I would not have found any books about peace. I know that's true because Amazon didn't exist 50 years ago. But if it did, there would have been very few. Now there are nearly 2,000 if you put that term into Amazon. And we're putting in place the institutions to make it happen. Certainly the United Nations, the U.S. Institute of Peace, those government-related institutions, but we also have the private sector, nonprofit organizations, private citizens coming together to work for peace, the Alliance for Peace Building and GPAC and so on. And we measure things that we value and we are finally measuring peace. Never happened before. The Global Peace Index developed an analysis of the most peaceful countries in the world. We now rank the most peaceful countries in the world. We know who the most peaceful countries in the world are, and guess what? They're also the most prosperous and successful. Peace and prosperity go hand in hand. This nonsense that war is good for the economy is absolute rubbish. It is simply not true. Peace and prosperity are what go hand in hand. We now know that. And because of this research, we now know the drivers of peace. We know what factors that we can develop in our societies to enable them to function in a more peaceful way. That's pretty darn remarkable. Nothing like this ever happened before in human history. We're doing it now. That's a pretty good deal. And it's working. I know we have the impression that the world is falling apart. It's not. I got news for you. It's not. In fact, the level of violence going on right now is so small from a historical perspective that it doesn't even show up on the chart. Doesn't even make a blip on the chart compared with what it was decades ago and centuries ago. Think about that. Phenomenal progress. Now, that's not to say we've reached nirvana. We haven't. Still dreadful stuff. We see about it on the news. And we have a long ways to go. But we are putting in place the systems and the mechanisms to resolve these violent conflicts without resorting to further violence. That's awfully, awfully good news. Now, I know peace is possible because I've had the opportunity to do something about it. I joined the Peace Corps. Well, I was a student activist first, anti-war activist back in the 60s, proud of it. Then joined the Peace Corps, lived in Colombia, South America, worked in a fishing village. We organized a fishing co-op, built a school. And then years later, I became president of the National Peace Corps Association, the organization of returned Peace Corps volunteers. And we started mobilizing people with that experience to deal with some of the toughest issues in the world. We got directly involved in the genocide in Rwanda, for example, and made a significant difference. Then in the spring of 1999, I got a phone call from my friend John Garamendi. John had been Deputy Secretary of Interior in the Clinton administration. He and his wife Patty had served in Ethiopia in the Peace Corps. And he called and said, Chick, my friends are killing each other and we've got to do something about it. I said, John, I don't have a clue what we can do, but let's give it a try. War had broken out between Ethiopia and Eritrea. So John and I contacted the embassies and said, we would like to help if you want us to help. If you don't want us, we're not going to get involved. But if you want us to help, we'll help. So we met with them and we built a trust relationship. Now, I had just left the National Peace Corps Association. John had left his position at the Department of Interior. Neither of us had positions of any significance. And yet they welcomed us in and they worked with us because we listened to them. We built a trust relationship with them. And they knew that our only motivation was to find peace. We were not on anybody's side. We weren't on Ethiopia's side or Eritrea's side. Our only motivation was to try to help them find a path to peace. We were invited to the capitals of each country to meet with the heads of state of the countries. And working with the African Union, eventually we got down to the point where there was one last issue that had to be resolved. And that was the sequence of the modalities to implement a ceasefire between the two countries. One side or the other was going to have to make a concession. John and I went to the office of Gabe Maritab, who happened to be a very close friend of Eritrea's President Isaias. And we urged him to consider making that last concession. There was a long pause, and finally he said, okay, he was willing to do it. I jumped into a cab, went straight to the Ethiopian embassy. The ambassador was not there, but the deputy chief of mission, Fisaha Aduna, was there, and he welcomed me into his office immediately. We had become good friends. I said, let's go over this one more time. You tell me that if Isaias is willing to make a concession on the sequence of the modalities, the war will be over. Is that right? Yes, that's right, but all he wants is war. He'll never do it. I said, I know how you feel, but he just did. I don't believe you. I said, have I ever steered you wrong? He says, no, but I can't believe it. I pulled out my cell phone and said, I've got the embassy on speed dial. We'll call him right now. You can't do that. He wouldn't let me use my own phone to verify the end of a war. I said, okay, I know the rules. But please tell the Prime Minister what I just told you. A few weeks later, Prime Minister Meles was in Washington. He invited us to have breakfast with him. And over breakfast, he said, I want you to know the war. Pardon me, I get emotional about this. It was 15 years ago. I still get emotional about it. He said, I want you to know the war is over, and I want to thank you for your role in making it happen. A couple of guys doing what we could do. We were invited to the treaty signing ceremony in Algiers. Pretty special experience. And we got a letter from the Prime Minister thanking us for creating the momentum and the spirit that made this historic achievement possible. Now, that meant an awful lot. But far more important than that was that a couple of months after the treaty signing ceremony in Algiers, I stopped at a kiosk at the corner of 18th and L to buy a hot dog. The woman in the kiosk was from Eritrea. And so I mentioned to her that I knew her president, Isaias Afwerki. And she kind of stared at me on how many people have ever heard of Eritrea, let alone know the president, buying a hot dog here in Washington. She says, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm Chic Dambach." I said, "I know you. I know who you are. You brought peace to my country." This was a hot dog vendor at 18th and L. Knew everything we had done. She had followed the news. She bounded out and gave me a big hug, and Yeshu and I have been best of friends ever since. That's what we did it for, was for the people like Yeshu, for the real people who are the victims of warfare. So I tell that story because it indicates what private citizens who care and are willing to put in the time and effort can do to make a difference. Because of that, I was given the opportunity to provide leadership for the Alliance for Peacebuilding, the network of people and organizations that are dedicated to reducing the frequency and severity of violent conflicts around the planet. Peacebuilders address the root causes of violence as well as the proximate factors that drive societies to resort to violence, and we help develop alternative ways of resolving the differences without killing each other. I retired a few years ago. Melanie Greenberg has taken over. She has elevated the organization and the peace-building community way beyond anything I was able to do. So proud of her and the work that she does. And I am also very confident about the future of this whole concept of peace-building and what can be done, largely because of the young people that I get to know and work with. For example, I got to meet about a decade ago a young lady who was studying here. She's from Sarajevo, studied here at Hamilton College here in the US. And she has become a well-known writer and lecturer on building respect for and understanding of young Muslim women in the world and their role in the world. As her husband said of her as we had dinner night before last, she's a Muslim feminist. And she is. She is changing the world, and I am so proud of her. She's here. Riala? Proud to have her as a friend. And I get to spend almost every day working with two of the most amazing young people in the world. A young man from Egypt named Michael Nabil. Michael was part of the uprising in 2011. He was arrested 5 times and tortured. And he went on a hunger strike for 130 days, barely survived, to draw attention to the cause. Now, Michael and his colleagues didn't succeed in the Arab Spring 6 years ago. But the spirit and the concept of it is alive and well, and they will prevail someday. You can count on it. I get to work with Michael, and it is such a privilege. And because of people like him, I know that we have a great future. And I get to spend a lot of time with Victor Ochen. By the way, Victor and Michael, the 2 youngest Africans ever nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Both of them nominated in their 20s. Amazing young people. Victor was born and raised in a displaced persons camp in northern Uganda on 1 meal a day. His family was attacked by Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army, and he lost his brother. Was tempted to take up arms and fight back, but he said, if I do that, that just perpetuates the violence. Instead, he started to mobilize a youth movement for peace in the displaced persons camp. At age 12, he did this. By age 30, he had accomplished so much that Forbes magazine, just a year ago, listed the 10 most powerful people in all of Africa. One of the 10, Victor Ochen. And the United Nations has named Victor their official worldwide ambassador for peace and justice. He's still in his mid-30s. Amazing young man. So I get to know and work with these extraordinarily young people, Riala, Michael, and Victor, and they just represent dozens, hundreds, thousands of young people all over the world who are aware of and embrace the value of building a more peaceful world. Because of that, I'm convinced that we are on the right path, that it will indeed happen. I started with a reference to Sisyphus from Camus' book. And as you'll probably recall, Sisyphus was condemned to push a boulder up a hill only to see it roll back down to the bottom, and we've traditionally interpreted that as a dreadful punishment. Camus reinterpreted that and said, well, actually, that's pretty much the human condition, isn't it? We push a rock up the hill only to see it roll back down. But Camus identified the boulder as being life's purpose. It was a metaphor for life's purpose. And he said, as long as we have a purpose, as long as we have a boulder to push, we have joy in our lives. And for those of us in the peace-building world, that boulder is called peace. And yes, we push it up, and yes, it rolls back down. We don't always succeed. Violence comes up again. But we go back to that boulder, and we put a shoulder to it, and we push with joy, knowing that we are getting it higher and higher every time. And for that reason, I remain confident that the world is indeed on the right path, that the curve of history is toward peace and justice, that we will never reach nirvana, we'll never reach total peace on earth, but we do make it more peaceful as we continue to believe in and commit ourselves to doing what it takes to build a peaceful world. We exhaust the limits for peace. Why not? Why not peace? Thank you very much.